which I would obviously do. And so that
You
doesn't,
you
that
can't actually check the chain data though. UMA consensus is still gonna run on the authority nodes, and the miners are still gonna get paid whether your GraphQL says it or not.
yeah. But if you were to give, if people are, let's say, validating based on the wrong state, they would obviously, I could erase the hotkeys
Oh, I see
of
what
the,
you're saying.
so they wouldn't get the messages signed, and you could really mess with things. And so it's good that we have that centralized state, which is fairly trustworthy, although um, it's not exactly decentralized as much as it could be. Um, and so let's talk about one of the things we wanted to talk about was um, incentive landscapes, because you've built or are currently running a variety of subnets on BitTensor. Which ones are those that you've participated in?
But on building the subnets,
Yeah, like which ones have you built or helped
uh,
build?
well, me and you built the incentive mechanism for 9 together. I think that was sort of groundbreaking, the design that we created, where it's sort of the winner take all design, which is maximum incentive to improve. Because I mean, as you can see on Subnet 9, it's like I don't know the exact number, 100 tau per day
And today
for
as well,
just
first place
creating
taking
the
home
best model.
2,500
It's
out
like,
of
oh, okay, any
these.
machine learning engineer comes in, and that's massive incentive to come in. I think people underestimate the value that BitTensor can create through subnets if incentives are properly aligned. And that's why it's so important. I wrote a paper about this in section 5 on the Medium article I wrote about BitTensor on specifically the reward mechanism. And it's definitely not something that my subnets are doing perfectly either, but I would love to discuss the ideal reward mechanism and how subnets should operate so that we can attract the most value to BitTensor long term, and that the subnet designs can be as ideal as possible for both bringing in developers and distributing the rewards fairly so that there's no exploits.
What is the ideal incentive landscape?
So there's a couple things. One, I think it almost certainly has to be exponential. Um, if it's not exponential, or the more exponential it is, the more incentive there is to get to that next step, the next rank. And as you get near the top, it's just more and more incentive to improve. It just gets to be a super fierce battle between the people at the top. Where if like UID, the second or third ranked UID is making only one half as what the first UID is making, even if it's not exactly winner take all, but it's a steep incentive curve with an exponential normalization. I think that's how you maximize competition.
A good example of this, I think, in practice is like Subnet 9, but there are other subnets that have this sort of exponential quality to them. Subnet 3 has this quality. If you look at their curve, like I think it's kind of fun to look. Let's do some like incentive landscape analysis. Um,
Yeah, and honestly, it's not a difficult problem to solve. We actually did this with Subnet 22. We had a very flat we had a very flat incentive curve. Um, and if you just renormalize the curve to an exponential curve, and then there's a variable called the exponential exaggeration factor, you can set that to 5 or 6 or 7, and it makes it an almost perfect exponential curve based on what the previous incentive landscape looked like. I had a graph somewhere in the announcements when I posted about the exponential normalization that we are implementing in Subnet 2. We recently reverted a bit until we reverted it from 5 to 3, but um,
let's
yeah, I think
let's
also it can very easily implement it.
For Mike D, can you guys explain what this is about more? So I think that like one of the arts that we've begun to explore in BitTensor in general is incentive design theory. Exactly. So Moggs just put SN3 currently my shell, right? And what you see here in this chart is it's almost like a Dirac delta function or like a hockey stick. It's like the climate, you know, from 1950 onward, right? This is not good for climate science, but it's really good for incentive landscapes because when you have this super flat distribution at the bottom where no one's making any incentive, and then a hockey stick, it means that there's so much demand to improve a singular UID rather than just taking up space. Um, like here's an example of the opposite quality, right? So this is, I'm not going to name subnets. I'm going to put this into the chat. So this is like a communist. This is a communist distribution. That's a that's communist incentive landscape. This is this is a Dirac delta function, right? There you go. Here we go. This is actually, that's Dirac himself being like, yeah, I love that steep curve right there on the right. And you know, the boo from the communists, because if you can just do sorta okay, you just run the standard miner, then all of the work goes into just getting the registrations. Like you know a lot about this because Fish, you've mined it at various times. Like, so what exactly happens when you have a flat landscape like this?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why it's bad actually. I was actually talking in one of the subnet channels yesterday saying how they could, because one of the reasons why it's bad is it means that if the entire thing is flat, it means there's no way miners can improve. Because if there was a way miners can improve and get that massive incentive increase, they would do it. But if it's flat, that means it's basically impossible to improve at all. And when it's impossible to improve, that means your subnet doesn't improve as a whole. It means there's no competition. It means you're not taking advantage of what the fundamentals of BitTensor are supposed to represent, which is continuous competition. At
Yeah,
making your algorithm more efficient, higher quality, higher quantity, higher bandwidth, so many different things that you should be able to compete on, and you can't if the validation mechanism doesn't actually reward you for improving these things.
like here's an example of a comment in your subnet after the fact of you guys making this exponential drive, right? You know, this guy, I don't know who this is, Sci Fantastic. He's like, the competition here is super fierce. He doesn't even know what's going on. He knows
No,
that he can.
that's actually a really good miner in our subnet. He's been mining for months, but it shows how when you have a curve like that, there's constant drive to improve because there's always aspects. Whether, I mean, with specifically 22, you can either improve the relevancy score, you can improve your indexing, your caching, your speed, your LLM analysis of the returned results. All these things that you can improve on, and then like I mentioned, if it's flat, then you're like, yeah, okay, I'll just return 10 okay results and I'll get a max score because the validation mechanism is broken.
Yeah. And my favorite quote now, I want to get a t-shirt that says this. It just says, fuck the miners. Because I think I have got a little image for that. This is number one rule of building a subnet. Like, make it really hard for miners.
Right. I
If
mean, but it's not, you can't just say fuck the miners and then let them figure it out. There's a second part that has to come up to it, which is creating the exponentially based validation mechanism, which allows for the competition that the miners should be able to improve upon and then get adequately rewarded for. If that doesn't exist and you say fuck the miners, then it's not going to be useful.
Right. And so what do I mean by this sort of quite crass saying is that you want it to be exponentially difficult for the miners. So you don't even, I think that a good subnet shouldn't even need to define, like it shouldn't even have to write the miner code, right? It, if the validation process is properly defined, the miners should be able to write the actual code for to suffice to fit into the reward landscape themselves. And I think that some of the best ones out there are like they have this design, which is it's like some threshold. You said this to me. It's like there's a quality threshold, which is binary, and then it's just multiplied by the number of things that you can provide. So, for instance, like here's an image of that. Your score's UID is the number of valid GPUs you have, the number of valid tweets you can scrape, the number of valid gigabytes of storage you have, the number of valid folds. And you can maximize N, right?
To infinity.
And to infinity. Rather than saying, And this was like a big mistake that a lot of early subnets made, is that they were like, okay, to become a legitimate miner, to get to be a good miner on subnet, I think the first scraping subnet was you had to be able to return 50 legitimate tweets every time a validator pinged you.
Mhm.
And what happened is that the miners just all asymptote at being able to return 50 valid tweets every time they get queried, and then the only dimension to actually in optimize on is the number of UIDs, right? Rather than being able to scrape more tweets and make more value for BitTensor, they just buy more UIDs, right? And I think that that's what shows up in good or bad subnets. So like, let's go back to the MyShell subnet. Here's the
I
MyShell.
think actually, I think subnet 12 actually is a great example
Yeah.
of because subnet 3, my shell subnet, that's a training subnet. It's a bit different than a commodity producing subnet like subnet 12.
So let's look at subnet. What was it? Subnet 12? Yeah, let's look at
Yeah.
subnet 12. So on something like subnet 12, and this shows up in the registration distribution. So if we go to Horde on TauStats, thank you, Mog, for your amazing website. If we look at the distribution, that's the one that Mog posted in the channel. We can throw it in here. We can see that it has this Dirac delta function style. There you go. Thank you, Mog. But let's look at the registration costs. Perfect example. Perfect example of there's basically no reason to have more than one UID, because
Right.
the dimension that you can optimize is by having more GPUs and one UID rather than having 100 UIDs with one GPU.
Right. I do think, although this flatness is still somewhat of a problem on this, the 90% of flat UIDs on subnet 12. Whereas, yeah, they're all providing one GPU, so they should all be rewarded the same. Not really, because there's other aspects you can score on, which is GPU speed, the CPU that's attached to the GPU, RAM, storage. I mean, all those things are also important, especially when you're trying to create a product out of this. If you're trying to create like a vast AI or a runpod.io replica, then no, you shouldn't get the same amount for all GPUs, even though it's technically is the same GPU type. But the great part about this curve, why I told you to put it in here, is how you have exponentially or multiplicative the reward depending on how many multiples of that GPU you're providing.
Right.
What are your thoughts on a flat curve where new miners, where immune keys get quite high along the curve? They can withstand the cut. Whereas something like 12 here, there are basically all immune keys, all new keys are right down at the beginning with zero or almost no incentive. Versus
Yeah, that's a bad sign. That's a bad sign.
No, I think the way that they do it is they just take a long time to evaluate the miner, which is fine. By the time that the immunity period ends, they've been evaluated and they'll be with the rest of the UIDs. I mean, it's very easy to create it so that this isn't the case. If you either remove the exponential, you remove the moving average, number one, which I think 19 used to have no moving average. So yeah, you can within 20 minutes be at the top of the subnet curve. But there are reasons why moving averages are important, such as you accurately get a full vision of the UID's performance over n time steps. Whereas with the alpha value A, you can replace 5 to 20% of the total score over time. So it's more holistic, but yeah, there's good and bad reasons for this. I don't think it's a binary answer. It's always bad if UIDs are low, or it's always good if the mean UIDs are within the rest of the curve.
So, okay. Another question. So you're actually, we've talked about how we want to lower registration costs, but here, this is subnet 18, I believe, 18 or 19. And it's gone a different type. It's a 19. It's gone a different route. It's a deterministic redundant validation process, if I understand correctly. The registration cost is very high because there's not that much innovative potential for a miner. So, yeah, hey, Namare, get up on stage. Let's talk about this. Here we go.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello. So what's your opinion here, Namare, on this, given that I think that for at least for some problems, a low registration burn cost showcases that there's a lot of competition, but this is not the case for 19. And so how do you frame that? And like, what's your take?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting problem though. There's two aspects to it. So one is having a high registration cost bad? So I think Victor touched on this a few weeks ago in Novelty Search. From Subnet 23, that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have high registration costs, although it's indicative of sort of the profit margin that a miner makes, right? It's pretty proportional to the registration cost. It's not a bad thing to have tau being recycled if not all the compute is needed. So one thing you could do is you could say, okay, I'm gonna, like, let's take subnet 18 as an example, right? What you could do is you could say, I'm going to reward a miner for the exact amount of dollars that they provide, right? So their exact spend to OpenAI, I will give them a reward proportional to that. So what would happen is the registration cost would go to zero, and all miners would just spend every single penny they've got straight to OpenAI. And then, so like the whole reward would be the subnet distributes emissions to the miners and they go straight to OpenAI.
I don't think that's necessarily true. Sorry. But like, for example, what subnet 23 does is they create the queue based on your bandwidth, and they don't actually use all of that bandwidth, but that's the proportion of the frequency of miners that they ping for each question, whether or not they actually use bandwidth.
Yeah, you could ping them some percentage of the time, right? So like, 0.1% of the time, I will ping them for 10% of the bandwidth or whatever. But as the more proportional you go to their spend, which is what it is, right? OpenAI or GPU costs or whatever, the lower the registration costs will go, but the more money is spent on them resources. So right now, for example, on 19, the thing that's happening is the miners are not having to spend that money on resources right now. So instead, they're spending it on registration costs. And I think that's not ideal. I think the most ideal way to do it is to try and incentivize them to ramp up their bandwidth as much as possible with the quality factor, with a caveat that, like, you can't just say, I'm going to test a miner for infinite amount of queries, because the validated machines would not be able to handle it. And they would all go down. So like, you have to get smart about it. You have to say, okay, maybe I'll try and increase the number of tasks they can do. So what's going to happen is on 19 there'll soon be like 50 tasks or 100 tasks. So now you might not necessarily have to optimize for 1 million requests per second will not get you the most incentive. It might be 1,000 requests per second across 100 tasks, which has more cost, but the validators can still validate. So it's like, I disagree that it's a trivial thing to solve. Like, we could easily try and reshape the distribution curve to look more exponential, but I only want the curve to look exponential if it's something I want to optimize for. And right now, the miners, every time we increase the synthetic rate, the curve goes slightly less flat, and the miners go and build their load balances, they get better, and then it goes flatter again. And then we're in that perpetual game until we open it up more, and then you'll see reg costs drop.
Anamare, when you guys turn up the synthetic query rate, you make it more difficult for miners. You make it more expensive for miners as a consequence. Do you see that there's elasticity in the registration cost as a consequence of that? Like, do the registration rates drop?
Yeah, I mean, if we were to look at a few weeks ago, I don't know if you can see it on Tau Stats, but the registration cost regularly hit. I mean, it's in +8, +9, +10. You see it for short term, but then the long term, the miners get better with their load balancing. And at the minute, they simply don't need enough hardware to materialistically affect the registration costs, I don't think. Unless we were to, it's more of a validator limitation and bottleneck, right? Because the validators struggle to pump through, especially image requests, because they're like megabytes at a time. I think Subnet 17 is seeing this quite a lot recently, where on Subnet 17, I think it's text to video, the resource, the commodity they're producing, the assets, they're massive. And what's happening is the validators can only accept very limited amounts of them. So I think a few weeks ago, Subnet 17 had a really lovely curve, and then it's got a bit more flat because the validators are just like at their limit, pretty much. So it's battling both things.
So it's interesting. like on one side, some subnets, it's about extracting the most value. And then on the other side, like what you're describing too, Namare, is like there's an ability, and Nish talked about this, of making the network efficient in terms of cost. Like if the registration rates go up, the miners are you're sucking the excess out of the network from the bottom, right? Rather than making them go up infinitely into the right in terms of productivity, it's more about extracting the bottom end, like taking the excess profit. And then BitTensor doesn't pay for that, right? Because we actually are burning that tau.
Yeah, exactly. The registration cost it's not proportional, but it's loosely proportional to the profit margin of a miner, right?
Yeah. So what are we looking at here? Fish. What's this? This is the 3 month.
I just sent 3 months because.
Is that 19?
Yeah, this is 19.
So you look about May the 20th or something. Can you see there's like a dip there? And look May the 3rd, there's a dip there again. So I guess that's the point where their profit margin's lower because the synthetic rates go up, right? So they're having to spend more on cost until they optimize, and then you see it go back up again.
It's fascinating. Are there plans to try and make an unbounded nature to subnet 19 and 18?
Yeah, 100%. I can't speak for. I'll let Fish speak for 18, but for 19, that is like the number one thing we're working on right now, and it's like extremely close. I think we still need to be cautious because what I don't want to happen is validators get overwhelmed or they all struggle and they can't keep up with the rates. You need to be smart about how we test. You can't test unlimited volume, right? It's just not possible to test 100% of the time. So we need to be smart about how we test, especially across 256 miners. And this is one conversation I want to have is, should we reduce the miners on some subnets? Because if I only need one UID, I really don't need 256 UIDs right now. Like the amount of unique entities on 19 must be like 40 or something right now in terms of unique people, or entities or companies, because obviously one entity has lots of cold keys. So one of the questions is, okay, one way we could do it is we could reduce the number of UIDs by like a factor of 10, and that reduces the validator bandwidth by a factor of 10. Is one example. Then you would, like Fish mentioned earlier, you would only query miners for, let's say, 10% of their bandwidth on average, something like that. So, and if you increase the number of tasks, you then make it more expensive without having to necessarily do more queries or have more volume. So we're just trying to flesh out how not to crash the validator, but still send it as close to exponential as possible, whilst not artificially trying to get an exponential curve. Because again, I want meaningful progress and not progress just for the sake of a nice curve, personally.
Well, more on that topic later, because it's something that was coming down the pipes from the foundation, is the ability to actually change the UID count and have more like dynamic style tempos per subnet and things like this that I think are a good dimension for people to optimize. Back in the day, before we really understood how subnet UIDs worked, we wanted to push the number of UIDs. We were like, no, we need more. We need 100,000. We need 1,600 UIDs on subnet 1. We need so many because that's what's going to create the diversity. But what we've discovered is that in practice, there's only going to ever be less than 10 true competitors on a subnet, and the slots. The appearance of 256 UIDs is sort of a red herring. People think, oh, that means there's 256 participants, but most subnets are actually dominated by maybe 5, right? People that are competing with each other, and so does that mean you only ever need really 5 UIDs? It's very interesting, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like when you look at if you naively just take the cold key distribution as okay, each cold key is a separate entity, you get to like some number 30 or 40 or something like that. And then when you take into account, half of them cold keys are duplicated, you get like 10 to 15 or something. And so I think in a funny sort of way, only needing one UID is way more decentralized. Like having 30 UIDs only, but you only need one, is way more decentralized than 256. So that's one massive pro. So like, although like we might have 25 UIDs in the future, and people are like, oh, I know people are going to say that's not really very decentralized. You've only got 25 competitors. But it's going to be way more decentralized than it is right now with 256, I think.
Yeah.
Decentralization is always an illusion. It doesn't
Yeah.
actually matter anyways. Whoever's
Well.
providing the service the best is going to keep providing the service the best. And then, I mean, if I'm a client or a buyer of a product on a subnet, I'm not going to want, okay, here's a pity incentive. You can stay on the subnet just because I want another guy to be able to provide the product when someone else can provide it better and faster and with higher bandwidth.
Well, Sammy says something in the chat here that I think is really important. It's like permissionless is actually the core ingredient, right?
Exactly.
If you had just one UID, then that's not positive for the actual competition. That like it becomes very permissioned. It becomes very difficult to compete, to have a lot of competition in the subnet if you just have one UID, because maybe you just have somebody competing and no one can get a chance to showcase themselves. Like it lowers, it really makes the incentive landscape very jagged or like binary, rather than there is some positive qualities to having a subnet or an incentive landscape that's not just a pure Dirac delta function, right? Like just 0 or 1. And maybe that's the problem with something like subnet 9 that we're perhaps seeing right now, is that the winners take all. Although it creates a lot of competition for that top slot, it makes it really difficult for people to ramp up. Right, so maybe that's why we have more than one UID, and maybe that's why the perfect Dirac delta function is not the solutions. Maybe for something like subnet 9, there should be like a competition at 1 billion and 3 billion and 7 billion and 6 billion, so that minor teams actually have a chance of competing. Whereas, do you see what I'm saying? And that's why I think decentralization is important in the UID set, is just so that people have a chance to get in and compete. And then it's not permissionless. Sorry, it is permissionless or less permissioned.
What I think you want, I think Floppy touched on it. I think you both touched on it. What you want is, as a user, right? You want access to the best of whatever it is, or whatever service it is you're after. So, like, let's say an API. I just want access to the best API provider. I don't care who it is. So, the point of being centralized, though, is one, I can have some judge. I can have some way of making sure that the best exists, right, through the incentive mechanism of the validator. The reason I don't want one UID is I want them to be pushed. I want them to be as good as possible. I want them to be challenged, and then I want multiple of them. In the case of failures, one of them goes down, one of them decides to set up shop or whatever. That's all you really want. You only really need like 5 UIDs for that. If you boil it down to its core, it's a minimum. The minimum is very low. It's nowhere near 256. You only really need a few to do that. And that's why the exponential curve, I guess you two desire it so much, is that it's like the hot poker, right behind them. So like you really need to keep your game up or someone's going to come and take all your incentive, as opposed to you need to keep your game up or you're going to lose 0.01%.
Right.
Let's transition. Let's transition into a contentious topic. We just released some. What's that?
Someone just said Fish doesn't even run an open validator. Nonsense.
Well, let's talk about that. Maybe we can get John Durbin up on stage if you'd like to. We just released the ability to enforce a commit reveal strategy on validators setting weights. And this is something that we've given out to subnet owners so that they can write it into their code and have validators that are weight copying be some number of blocks behind those that are actually validating, right? When it comes to their view on the incentive distribution. This has been a long topic of conversation. And I actually want to talk to Isabella. I'm going to try to get her on the stage because she wrote a lot of the research here. Isabella, I'd like you to explain the concepts behind your paper. Maybe someone can post it in the channel, the research that we put out around this. Here it is. I think I believe I have it here. Hey, Isabella, welcome to the stage.
Okay. Let me first send a copy of our research paper. Oh, you just did. Okay. So I've just sent a copy of our research paper into the novelty search chat room, and you guys can have a look. So here maybe I'll just give a brief description of what weight copying is. So essentially, in BitTensor, we encourages validators to do validation work on miners. So such that miners can be rewarded based on their performance with incentive, and the validators can get their bonds towards these miner and get rewarded with dividends. But then the problem is that some validators may opt to get rewarded with the same dividends without doing any work for validation. And they can do so by like copying the weight that is produced by some other validators, or just copying the consensus. So let me share my screen, and okay. So here is a plot where it shows the relationship between the dividend per stake that the validators are getting, comparing to the weights that they comparing to the difference of the weights that they set with the consensus. So here it basically saying that for the weight that you're setting on a chain, the closer it is to the consensus, then you'll get a higher dividend per stake. So it means that like if there is such validator who is doing honest work, and the honest work may not always stick to the consensus, right? Then they could end up with like getting a lower dividend per stake than someone who is always copying the consensus. So this would be the problem. And how would it affect the consensus is basically like the consensus may move slower because some of the old weight or old consensus will get carried over to the new epoch and then do another round of consensus calculation. So like the whole consensus may move slower. And the other problem is that the emission to the honest validators may get lower as well, because those weight copier who gets a higher dividend per stake, they can potentially get a higher emission through like this copying consensus, right? So that more nominators will stick to them, and then less nominator will stick to the honest validator who can like which can hurt the emission to these honest validator who actually does the actual work. So our solution would be here. So here we are introducing a term commit review weight interval, which is T1 here. So basically what it means is like we would like to create a difference in time for when the weights are generated comparing to when the weights or consensus are made visible to the public, such that when the weight copier does the copying, the weights would be outdated and hopefully out of consensus. So this would be our solution. And then is there any problem? Or if not, then I can move on to talking about some experimental results.
I believe there's an image just above this algorithm one, Isabella, in the chart here, which showcases how this works, right? So you have in the red line, you have the weight copier validator, and the J line, the blue one, is the honest validator. And you can is it the other way around? I think it's the other way around. No, right? So the red is the honest, and the blue is the weight copier, and you can see the lag between the weights set by the blue based on the consensus created by the red. That's right.
Yes, that's right.
So let's take a look at the experimental results here.
Okay. So for the experiment, we have defined okay. So for the experiment, we have defined a metric G, which is basically the dividend per stick that's from the copier, comparing to the median of dividend per stick from honest validators. And all of the experiments is based on some historic metagraph. So it's like on real data. And then for the experiment results, first we can talk about like what different G means. So when G is larger than 1, then it will mean that the validator who adopts this consensus copying strategy is having an advantage over some other honest validator, such that it will attract more nominators to stick to those consensus copying validator. And then they can like earn more dividend take. And when G is in between 1 and 1 minus dividend take, then it means that validator, well, the consensus copying validator is losing to the honest validator, such that these nominators will move over to stick to honest validator. So here we have set a threshold 1 to consider our commit refill strategy to be successful. So here are some plots showing how would it work out for different subnets. So in the plots, in the upper plot, it is showing that the subnet where its G is like always larger than 1 for whatever commit reveal weight interval it would be. So like it
So this
means that like
this showcases that on these subnets, because of the way the incentive landscape moves over time, the commit reveal doesn't change things.
yeah, so the commit review, it will not like solve anything for these subnets. And then for the plots below, it is showing that when commit review would work for these subnets. And one observation that we can make here is that for these subnets, most of them get their G to be lower than 1 when it is like around 5 tempos. So it means that like even if they are setting the commit review wait in the interval to be like indefinitely long, it wouldn't like help them much. So it's like as long as they have set an interval to be like around 5 tempos, then it will be enough for them. So here I also have like a very rough plot for why can this be the case. So here I'm showing the difference in weight for 22 hours apart. And this is for subnet 9. So subnet 9 is like one of those that are having G larger than 1, meaning that the commit refill strategy wouldn't work for them because like their weight is barely moving.
Right.
Like
There's
even
hardly
after 22 hours. Yes.
There's hardly any churn in the miners, so you just set your weight to the top guy, and that's the best score you can get, and it's not going to change until somebody beats TensorFlex.
And this is like about the same case for subnet 20 and subnet 28. So the commit review, it wouldn't work for them because their weights barely change over time. And here, moving over, are some examples when the commit review strategy actually works. So we can see that subnet 8, subnet 30, and subnet 16, they have like a very essential changes in weight over time. So that's why it works a lot better for them. And yes. And moving over, here is another plot where we are showing like the relationship between the validator trust and also the relative dividend weight, which is G. So it is showing that like if you have a higher validator trust, then it's more likely that your subnets would be less affected by like people copying weights because like because everyone is having a high validated trust. If there is such a weights copier who get a high validated trust as well by setting weights to the consensus, then like it wouldn't give them much advantage, right? So comparing to here, the bottom green line, subnet 30, they have a very low validated trust. So it means that if someone comes in and set weights that is the same as the consensus, then these people who copy weights will get a lot of advantages comparing to like the rest of the subnets. So yeah. And then lastly, we have a table showing for each of the subnets what are the minimal commit review weight interval that you guys should set to make the commit review strategy works for you. And for those subnets who are not listed here, it means that this commit review strategy, it wouldn't work for your subnets.
So this also tells us a lot about how quickly the incentive landscape is changing on that subnet. So subnet 19 is here, kind of middle of the pack, and it's saying that if you set a commit reveal weight interval of 3,240 blocks for validators, that's the inflection point where weight copiers are starting to lose money relative to actual validators.
Yes.
Okay. So it makes a lot of sense for subnet 16, 2, 31, 12, 10, 7. And then it starts to maybe hurt the consensus algorithm later on, maybe for some of these subnets. And I think we still have to explore how this works out in practice. And subnet owners have a new tool to like, let's say, force validators to actually run their code if that's positive. But I think that like there's a bit of, I have a bit of a let's say like a nihilism towards this particular topic. I think that for some subnets it makes a lot of sense and we should try to kick out weight copiers. But also maybe for some subnets it's actually not a negative thing to have some validators that are not doing the quote unquote work. There's been a lot of like pushback on weight copying, but from the very beginning, when it became an issue, like 6 or so months ago, 8 months ago, my first statement on it was that like it can actually be positive for a subnet because it reduces the load on miners, and to a certain degree, it gives more power to those validators that are actually doing the validation process. So subnet 18, perfect example, right? So if, and Mog can probably speak to this, like or same with you, Namaray, like if what happens in the end, like shooting off into the distance here, what is the convergence state for weight copying, right? If everyone weight copies, then does that mean that anybody who sets any weights basically has 100% of the control of the subnet?
You go, Mark, or me? I'll take that.
You can do it. You can do it.
You can go. Okay. So the question was, Cons, that if everyone weight copies, everybody gets 100% of the control. Is that what you said?
Well, one can take to the limit. What happens if everybody weight copies? And like one of the effects of it would be lack of decentralization, because basically everyone's copying each other, and it converges to the ability for somebody to just set any weights, and then everyone will copy those weights, right? So they have full control of the subnet.
Yeah, I suppose what you're getting at here is that imagine everyone on 18 copied, right, except Mog. The Mog would be able to determine exactly what a good miner is and exactly what a bad miner is. That's got a double-edged sword, right? Mog could pick any miner he wants that best serves Corcel, for example, or Cortex, or whatever subnet. So we could have all the best miners, but then someone could easily just weight all their own miners. So you need enough to counter that cabal, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
Understands the consensus, doesn't it? You need to have the consensus. The majority needs to be performing the correct actions, because if it's a minority, then essentially the minority, although it sounds like a minority, they actually then have control, as everyone else is just taking their word for it. Look at it as the copying homework example for a class average. If everyone's copying off one person and that person decides to fill out incorrect answers, then the entire class average is brought down, versus if only a couple of people are copying, and the person they're copying from, or decides to give the wrong answer. So I understand what you mean, and I think that as soon as revenue generation from network access supersedes revenue generation from validated dividends, then this becomes much easier, because the value is in network access versus the money we make from validating. And obviously that's why the reduction in validated commissions is very, very important to helping to combat this, but it also needs to be coupled with the push towards revenue generation from subnets by validators themselves.
I actually disagree on the point where Mog said that the majority need to be not weight copying. You really only need one to not be weight copying for the subnet to survive. If weight copiers are doing stake weighted weight copying, no matter who is doing the validation and who is not, as long as at least one person is, it will eventually converge towards the truth. And aside from that, another important point is that the only people that are going to be using the subnet are the ones that are going to be not weight copying. So they should have full control. Why shouldn't the weights just be converged towards what they think? If Mog's going to be the only one using subnet 18 for core cell, he should be able to only set weights towards the ones that are valuable for his application. If nobody else is building applications, nobody else is setting weights on miners that are valuable to them, then there's clearly only some miners that are valuable to the network as a whole, which are the ones that are serving core cell the best, and they should get the most incentive.
Not
And
necessarily
that
the
should-
ones that are serving Corsell the best, but the ones that would be serving Mog the best in that case. So he could just set all his own miners to be one. The problem is,
Yeah,
if there's only one real
think that's a good
validator. Sorry, go on.
And to answer your question, Nick, if you ask anyone from the bottom of their heart to be 100% honest as to why they object to weight copying, they're not looking at the objective points that we're discussing here. It's about bottom line. He's earning more than me for doing less work. I'm paying more to do something. He's getting more for not doing that. And that's where this objection to weight copying comes to. Very few people are looking at it saying, well, I'm not sure how it's affecting consensus. Is it good for the subnet? Is it not good for the subnet? So the moment that validators are not making anything for operating on or for validating on a subnet, and it's their access to that subnet and what they build on top, then you have this effect that comes into play. As Namare says, if I'm the only one validating on subnet 18 because I'm the only one building on it and the only one monetizing that access, then I don't care what the other validators do, because they're not making anything from it. They're not making anything from any increased stake on that subnet. And when detail comes into place, it's not so much about the stake, overall stake to a validator, because you as a holder of TAO will be able to make those decisions yourself as to which validator you decide to stake to. And I'm not entirely sure how that does affect. If you stake to a weight copying, or more likely, I think it should be more profitable, especially with something like commit reveal, to stake to the validator that's actually doing the work and operating within the bounds of the subnet.
There was Fish, do you want to say something?
Go ahead.
We considered implementing a design whereby a validator could effectively, a validator could lease their stake to another validator on a subnet, which is basically what happens when people delegate, right? It's just I have some TAO, I delegate it to the Open Desert Foundation as a nominator, and they do this validation for me. That's effectively what weight copying is, right? On a subnet. If you weight copy on a subnet, you're giving the weight of your stake to the average. And when I think that, like, when we think about the long term of what's going to happen when there's hundreds or thousands potentially of subnets, that the weight copying will be in some sense a standard. because there's no way that you can run your validator on all those subnets. Things like STAU and DTAU, where you can specify where your stake is and you can have concentrations on some over the others, will help this a little bit. But I think that the real problem with weight copying is not so much about I think that the real problem with weight copying is that there's perverse incentives. It's more profitable to do this, not actually run a validator, than running a validator and helping with the decentralization of the network, or actually validating on the network. And that's not good, right? We want to flip the tables so that if you can, when it's the inverse, when it's like, well, you're going to make a little bit less money by doing weight copying, I think that's positive, because then then weight copying is like, hey, well, I don't want to put the work into this, but I want to keep my stake on that subnet, and I'm willing to take the cut. So now people are going to move their stake towards the validators that are running validators everywhere, and we let the market decide about where people should be putting their stake.
But Const, even if weight copiers make a bit more than the non-weight copiers, like you said, it's infeasible with the increase of subnets for people to validate on all subnets. You're inevitably going to have weight copying. I think weight copying is good from all perspectives, from other validators, from miners, from subnet owners, from miners, because they're getting less requests. It's less expensive for them to run their miner because they have less bandwidth that they have to provide. For validators, because they're getting more control and they have more say over which miners respond to them, and the bandwidth is centralized to just them, assuming the miners can blacklist the weight copiers. It's pretty easy right now for miners to dictate who is to figure out who's weight copying and who's not. You just look at who's sending you requests and who's not. Miners should be blacklisting all weight copiers, denying them access to the bandwidth. This does a couple of things. This increases bandwidth to the non-weight copiers, and when you have higher bandwidth, you should be using that bandwidth to create revenue, to create a product. So when you have a little bit lower revenue from not weight copying, that should make up from the bandwidth from the subnet. If the subnet bandwidth is not making up for that difference in revenue from the validator, then it's a bad subnet, because you can't create revenue from it.
Okay, but in contrast to that, I agree with you, except where you're wrong, or where I disagree, is that if a weight copier is making slightly more revenue, that's incentivizing those who are only focused on their staking rewards to give more stake to that validator, exponentially increase their stake and therefore their power in the network. And whilst
Mog, that gives more bandwidth to you. If they're giving more,
it gives you more bandwidth, or it gives the weight copier more bandwidth on the subnet that they choose. So whilst they may not care about the bandwidth on the other subnets,
they have no bandwidth.
Not on subnets they don't copy on. You can pick and choose. So let's say you copy across all but one. That's allowing you to have very, very good APR for stakers. So you're building up a lot of APR, something you've prioritized. You said yourself publicly, you're prioritizing building up stake, because you understand the power that will have for the future of the network, which is something I understood a year ago when Kant spoke about it, and it is very important. Having stake gives you access to the network that will be incredibly valuable and will give you bandwidth. But if you're financially benefiting as well, and then getting to pick and choose to only operate on a very small number of subnets, it's not going to be well perceived and well received by the other participants of the network. Let's put it that way. It's not going to be popular. If there could be an even balance, or a slight, as Const alludes to from commit reveal, a slight penalty for doing so, but then you don't mind because you're monetizing the subnets that you actually want to be involved in. I think it's a better state, and it's going to be received better by all participants and those involved in the network.
If anything, it incentivizes you to create a product with your bandwidth, to use it. If your subnet doesn't have bandwidth that can be used, your subnet should go away. All people should weight copy on that subnet, and then eventually, if nobody's using it, and then all people start weight copying, you should be weight copying on subnets that you don't use. There's no reason not to, because you don't need the bandwidth.
I agree.
From Weiji, what's your response to you're manipulating your weights to undermine subnets with incentive curves that you don't agree with?
I think he's referring to subnet 2, which is actually the opposite of weight copying. The miners should actually like weight copying because it's the convergence of the honest validators. On subnet 2, my validator happens to score specific miners 0 randomly, which is actually just a bug in my weight copying script. But yeah, it is actually. I thought about fixing it. I created the fix, and then I decided not to fix it because I thought that subnet 2 should have a more competitive landscape and more aspects to compete on. Because right now they can't compete; they just run. I don't want I don't want to talk about any subnets, but yeah, that's the situation with subnet 2. But that's also not referring to weight copying. That is a problem with not weight copying, but that could solve when I accurately weight copy.
From Sammy. So in detail, what happens to the subnets where the bandwidth has no value yet? I think this is a really important question about DTAO. Just generally, like how the subnets will monetize themselves in the long term. And I think that the answer to that question, Sammy, is the immediate value of holding the subnet control will not necessarily be the major determiner of the inflow versus outflow on that subnet. A lot of it will be about where things can go in terms of value. So if a subnet says, hey, look, we have this path towards monetization on the subnet, that I think will be the primary signal.
Const, do you think that it's true that subnets value should be directly proportional to the bandwidth they generate? Oh, sorry, to the revenue potential they can generate for validators.
Do I think? Sorry, say that one more time.
Yeah, sorry, I butchered that. Do you think it's true that subnets quote unquote value should be somewhat proportional to the revenue potential that validators have on that subnet?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think that has to be long term the thing that a subnet is maximizing in some way. And like there are some subnets that perhaps will be more like utility subnets that are being funded by the network. Like maybe 9 currently doesn't have a path towards monetization, but that's a longer conversation. I think it can and will. And so even in a DTAO universe, I think that it can get a lot of emission if it says, "Hey, look, we have this plan, and we're building this out. We're creating a bunch of miners here. We're incentivizing them to come into the network." But yeah, I think long term, we want the subnets absolutely to prove their value in terms of bandwidth on top of the subnet. Like that has to be the determiner of where TAO goes, in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I think this is one of the big distinctions between. I like Mog's quotes relevant here. I'm not in crypto anymore. I'm in BitTensor.
Yeah. Nick says,
think
e.g., the protein folding subnet just goes away then. Are you referring to weight copying, Nick, or are you talking about subnet value? Because I think that the protein folding subnet doesn't have that quality. I think that AlphaFold is valued at a couple $2 billion. Just
I was
by
going to say
folding.
one of the interesting things here is innovation value, and the bottom line is yes, innovation leads to value. And what'll be quite interesting with DTAO is you'll be speculating on perceived future value of something. You know, as is constantly pointed out to me, there's many businesses that are not making revenue for a period of time, but people plow millions and millions into them because they see the future value of what is being generated. So it may not be an immediate revenue measurement where validators can sit there and say, well, who's making more from which subnet?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we are operating in an incentivized network where the reward is a token that has a monetary value. And I know we don't talk about the monetary value in this Discord, but it is a natural market effect which the network aims to strive towards. And so I think it's idealistic and blinkered to not accept that.
And Nick, welcome to the stage.
Yeah, hey everybody. And Sammy speaks to this well too. He's written pieces about this, but I guess what I'm getting at is, we've got subnets that are focused on revenue generations, others that kind of contribute to the network by creating open source software. And so I guess the concern is like, and maybe I wasn't familiar on the protein folding specifically, but like the ones that are just contributing to open source software with no plans to revenue monetize, how does that, what's the kind of end path for them with after DTAO?
They would go away, and they should go away if they're not able to produce revenue from their subnet. Do you agree, Const?
I do agree. I mean, if BitTensor's subcomponents can't provide value, then the metastructure, like BitTensor itself, won't be able to provide value, and so long term BitTensor fails unless the subnets themselves can find a path towards monetization at some point. But I still think that there's, like Mutex said, can we talk about research and academic value? I think that research and academic value, it actually has monetary value at some point. It's just a longer time horizon. NASChain, right? They're doing neural architecture search, right? That's not a non-monetizable thing, right? Mutex, welcome to the stage.
You can monetize anything if it has value. Like Mixtral got raised at a valuation of $1 billion while open sourcing everything they had. Investors didn't invest on that under the assumption that everything was going to say open source and not monetizable forever. They assume the business model will eventually evolve where they can create revenue from that and they can create a return on their investment. I mean, that's how the whole financial monetary system works, is you need to create revenue. Otherwise, it's a waste of resources. And if you're creating revenue, there's a clear path. If you're creating value, there's a clear path to revenue.
Mutex, do you want to explain a little bit more about your comment?
Yeah. Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of academic background here, and I think it's also important that some of subnets, like I don't want to talk about my own subnet, but the protein folding, or if someone comes with DNA sequencing subnets, these are subnets that you cannot immediately create an API in a month or 2 months and just start selling some protein folding APIs to someone. So we might come up with some finding, and usually the way the money comes in, for example, for neural architecture search, and suddenly you find something, and some company like Qualcomm or Intel, they come and say, okay, we are gonna put $10 million in your idea or the way you are solving this problem. So some of subnets, I think, cannot immediately go out and sell out an API call. But I don't know what you guys think. Is this at all an important thing for BitTensor in general, or maybe this is not something that BitTensor is looking for?
No, absolutely. It needs to. The subnet needs to produce value at some point. It doesn't necessarily have to produce value today, but there needs to be a path from today to producing value and therefore revenue.
Mutex, there's such thing as speculative value, even if it doesn't have value right now, such as the example that I gave just 1 minute ago with Mixtral, open sourcing everything they made. Speculative value means there's a path to monetization sometime in the future, even if it's not right now. And that's just as important.
Yeah, I completely agree, but yeah, I also have to, some of the subnets, for example, NASChain, assuming that it's working perfectly, the customer to our subnet are going to be those who they are machine learning expert, companies that are not able to pay Google Cloud $100,000. So performing a NAS experiment on Google Cloud for a large data set costs $100,000. Takes 1 week to start and finish and get the result back. So this is a little bit different than selling an API to someone to maybe send a prompt and get a result back and pay maybe $1. So my customer is gonna be someone who is gonna pay between $30,000 and $100,000 to take the subnet hostage for a week to finish its experiment and gets its results back. So the way I have to incentivize this is I have to go to companies, I have to go to the Intel, Qualcomm, Texas Instruments who are trying to deploy models on the microcontrollers on custom chips, because you have to optimize model for a very certain number of parameters or number of operations. So that's something that some of subnets or protein folding or DNA sequencing, these are someone that might go out and bring out, they might do nothing, but suddenly they might bring millions as a funding or yeah.
Can I interrupt this one actually? Because it is a very interesting point and it touches on something that was polarized a while ago, which is subnets run by single entities who come on board with either a pre-existing brand or a pre-existing company. So there's two sides to it, I would say, in that needs to be communicated. Either whilst you're going out and contacting these Texas Instruments, these Intels, these clients for your subnet needs to make it possible for other validators, the participants in this subnet, to be doing the same if they chose to. Or there needs to be a clear path to revenue, and more importantly, how that revenue will be distributed amongst those that are essentially performing the operations that you need in order to generate that revenue. Because what's happening is you are being incentivized to run this subnet, you are being rewarded for it financially. So if you go off and then make company profits as a result, you are somewhat obligated to pay the workers, the participants within the subnet. So they're the two options that I feel the subnet has. Either allow people to create competing businesses, sorry if there's a baby crying in the background, competing businesses with you on your subnet, or have a clear path to revenue share with your eventual future perceived revenue.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. My point was just that we also trying to constantly publish, and I think one thing that's important is I don't see a lot of subnets. They might try to go to the blockchain conferences more than AI conferences, and I think it's important that we all also contribute to the research, because after all, we are all subnets that focus on AI in different subjects, and bringing visibility in publishing papers in name of subnet might not bring value in terms of money to the subnet immediately, but in an extensive amount of visibility can be shown in top conferences, AI conferences. For example, the subnet 9 and TensorPlex's finding, I don't know if they are going to publish, but that's the best way to show that there is a subnet out, there is a model that outperforms GPT, for example, and it's built in BitTensor, and it just opens up a huge amount of audience. Because I work in a AI tech company, and nobody knows about BitTensor. Nobody knows there is a they go to conferences all the time and they don't know there's such a thing that pre-training or fine-tuning all these subnets out there.
We got Sammy on the stage. This is an interesting conversation to be had here. So Sammy said, for subnets with only speculative value, won't validators all end up weight copying since bandwidth is not useful? And then there's a thread here, but let's go through that.
I can give my initial response that I said in the chat. Was that, well, first of all, this is under the assumption of DTAO, but assuming I have a validator, I have tokens in DTAO in this subnet, and I know that in the future I can sell access to my validator for $20,000 to $100,000 per task, as Mutex mentioned. I would of course run a validator and not weight copy, so that this subnet keeps improving, and eventually I can turn that value into fruition by eventually selling that access. And if I stop validating and instead weight copy, then there's no incentive to run a real miner anymore because everybody's validating. I mean, because everybody's weight copying and the subnet goes away, and then I can't monetize my tokens anymore.
But doesn't that just create the incentive for at least one person to end up validating, like say yourself, for example, and then you run into the whole problem where like you could be manipulating weights
But I wouldn't, because then the subnet wouldn't improve and I couldn't monetize my tokens. And yeah, you only do need one validator. That's not a problem. Because as long as this validator is planning on selling access, it wouldn't be a malicious validator because then the subnet is shit and it couldn't sell bandwidth.
I mean, you could still be malicious while helping improve the network. Like there could be one miner that's yours that you're helping or just giving like higher weight to while also like ranking everybody else honestly. So I disagree that
Well, no, because
percent
then the
honest.
subnet improves at a I mean, no, because then the subnet improves less quickly. And
Yeah,
there's a less clear path to success for the subnet.
I just don't see why like it just seems all very overcomplicated to where it could be much easier to just say no weight copying. Like the system could potentially break if it ends up where we're
Sammy,
at.
you lose Sammy?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Seems
Can
like
you
they
guys
could
hear me?
Yeah, we hear
Go ahead.
you.
Go ahead, Sammy.
I'm just saying it seems
Okay.
like the system, like if there's a possibility that the system could break if it got to the point where either all validators were weight copying or only one was honestly acting, then I don't see why the risk should even exist.
Well, yeah, it's up to that one honest validator to make sure it doesn't break. And if the subnet is as valuable as Mutex is talking about, that's enough incentive in and of itself to make sure it doesn't break, to make sure that you're continually running the correct code, that the code correctly incentivizes miners to improve, and that eventually you can get a product out of that through the speculative value of your bandwidth.
So I would just like to clarify one concept here, which so you guys have been talking about there only needs to be one honest validator in a subnet, but then that's actually not the case because consensus was calculated based on how many percentage, at least 50% of the stake agrees on a certain weight. So it would be like, say, for example, it's a new subnet. So the first validator come in and then it's not doing validation, it's setting random weights. And then more validators come in, they are all doing weight copying, right?
But nobody's setting random weights. We're assuming that the one honest validator, everyone's copying them. So in that case, yes, 150% agrees on the weights, and then you have consensus. So it works.
But your assumption of there being one honest validator, I don't think you can just fully assume that. So like
You can't. If the product isn't good, there might not be one honest validator, and the subnet should go away if there's no honest validators. If it's a product with value or speculative value, there would be at least one validator who wants to access that, who wants to sell access, who can create revenue from that, and they're going to validate. They're going to have all of the bandwidth if everybody else is weight copying. In a subnet today, that's not speaking monetary terms, access to like 300 tau per day worth of incentives and then they can distribute that however they want if everybody else is weight copying. That's an insane amount of power that this validator has to control the competitive landscape of these miners.
So I think you can think about a case where, say, there is one honest validator, but that honest validator only has like 5% of the stake. And then all the other guys, they are copying themselves. They are not copying from the honest validator. They're just copying themselves because like all of those weights copier, they have 95% of the stake in the subnet. So that then the consensus would be based on only those weights copiers, who is like just copying from themselves. And then when there is a new validator coming in, trying to do something honest, like maybe follow the honest validator's footstep, that will not success because like that honest guy will fail as well because like 95% is doing the same thing and weight copying from themselves.
No, it will succeed actually. Even if 95% of the stake is weight copying, it's basically just a moving average of alpha 0.05 towards the truth. So yeah, it won't immediately go towards the honest solution, but every epoch 5% or whatever the time step is between the commit and reveal, the consensus will go 5% more towards the honest miner weights.
But you assume that everyone is actually copying that honest miner floppy and not just saying, well, sod this, I'm just going to set ones or zeros for everybody. And if a majority can't even be bothered to do a proper sort of weight copying script, or they have an issue in their weight copying script, they may just not care and set completely irrelevant weights, and then others copy them. And yeah.
But Mog, that's why validators get monetized. And we assume they're going to run the most optimal weight copying script, which is stake weighted weight copying, which means that no matter how much stake a validator has, as long as they have 1 tau staked, it'll eventually converge towards the truth. Just below.
It's an interesting paradigm.
Yeah. I still don't see any scenario where with 1 honest validator we don't converge towards the truth. And then if there is not even 1 honest validator, then that means the product doesn't have value and the subnet shouldn't exist. So
I
think just to add a little bit more color, just one thing I wanted to add here is that if you do have 1 honest validator for a long time, then you're really just depending on that 1 validator. If that validator fails for any reason, whether they decide to stop being honest or if they just have a real failure, then you've just sort of borked the whole subnet, right? And that's when eventually.
Well, as soon as they get back,
that's when eventually it's going to have like no value. Yeah, if they come back online in time and everything, but you're still creating that sort of worry, right? So like in like a more, I want to put on like more corporate glasses here. If you're trying to build a product on top of that and you're dependent on 1 validator that's not going to break, it's not like just having 1 AWS instance that's running your entire product. You know what I mean?
Well, you can load balance your 1 validator. That's not a problem.
Good, but you're still in 1 spot. You know what I mean? You're still 1 validator. I'm not saying like from an infrastructure point of view you're centralized. I'm saying just generally from a consensus and from a product point of view, you are still centralized on 1 validator. So while it might not break the subnet, you're still creating a bit of a danger here. I mean, there's a risk. It's not 0 risk.
I mean, I don't really see what risk you're referring to. If you all of a sudden lose access to all of the miners, or like you get deregistered randomly, which I don't know how that would happen. But I mean, if the communication layer breaks between the validation and miners, that's not going to be specific to 1 validator, unless there's another form of breaking that you're referring to.
I'm referring to any form of breaking, not just 1 specific one. You know what I mean? Like if you're talking about, let's say down the line, 3, 4 years, 5 years down the line, something that's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, and it's a critical system subnet, and I've got 1 validator running, and everyone is copying that 1 validator. If that validator fails, then the system is converging towards failure until that validator comes back on. So you're sort of just putting all your eggs in 1 basket, so to speak. So from software perspective, it's a tad risky. We can't say it's 0 risk. You know what I mean?
I don't think so. I mean, you have the same situation with even OpenAI today. I mean, they're 1 company. Does that mean they have 1 point of failure? No. I mean, they can fail, and they have the risk of that, but they're not going to. I mean, if they take enough precautions, like yeah, OpenAI goes down every once in a while, but it's still a corporation, just like any other. Validations is we can just assume they're all corporations running their businesses for this validator.
Right, but aren't we all against what OpenAI is doing? Might not be the best. I see what you're trying to say, but it might not be the best example because sort of there is centralization on them.
It does reduce the competition to make the cheapest product at the validator scale if there's only 1 validator, right? But then again, you could also argue that if people are weight copying, they can always just unweight copy and create a product right then, and to create more competition at the validator level. And if there's incentive to do so, they would do so.
Right. And Shib sort of insinuated that I was referring to validators being similar to OpenAI, but the massive difference here is that it's both the permissionless thing that Sammy mentioned earlier, is that anyone can become a validator, anyone can unweight copy as soon as they want access, and anyone can access these products, and anyone can create the products.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm not disagreeing. All I'm saying is OpenAI is not a good example, but I see what you're trying to say.
Will this be like more like OpenAI? We have Wageich WEJH on this.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's Wedge Cons, by the way. But
Wedge.
so in regards to the sole validator situation, what do you think? Like, there's an inherent incentive for that sole validator to slightly boost his keys while still keeping the creation of the commodity like efficient. But there is some point and like on the axis where that validator will rank his keys so highly that the creation of the commodity fails to happen. But right under that point is the most optimal point for that sole validator to exist. So how do you combat that if having one validator is acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, that's just a question for the validator. They just have to run a benefit analysis between the revenue they're going to make from their miners that they're boosting unfairly, which would inevitably slow down the competition and progress of the subnet, actually decreasing the value, in a world of DTAO, increasing the total incentive that's being distributed to all miners, and in today's world, decreasing the root weights because the subnet is less valuable. So number one, you're decreasing progress not only by increasing your own miners that aren't performing well, but also because you're overall decreasing the total incentive that goes to all miners. So even if after that point you stop artificially inflating your own miners, you still have lower progress because there's now a less quantity of incentive that you can distribute to improve competition.
You could imagine in an S-Tau or a D-Tau environment too, if there was a validator that was doing this and maximizing the returns of his miners on the subnet, you have the other people with weight on the subnet that are really losing out from this, right? The subnet is dying and they're letting it happen because they're just weight copying this guy, right? So there's also, when this happens, there's also incentive for the other validators to really unweight copy, right? Because this single controlling validator is actually destroying the subnet.
Yeah, I can agree there. But my thing is more, how do you lessen the latency for that to happen? Because I mean, I think the situation that I described is it's quite obvious for a validator that just he's trying to profit max, either in truly 100% honest ways or the 50% honest way, or the 50% honest and 50% cheating. So how do you lessen the latency between that to happen? Because I think that would be a pretty long latency.
Right. I would just assume if that's happening to any extent, the subnet won't succeed. You need a validator who really cares about the product, building the product, and improving the product for the subnet to succeed.
So, as Shib said, wouldn't you say that's a single point of failure? As if, even if the idea was really good, I mean, a sole validator could kill it.
Yeah, sure. Your hypothetical situation is where you have no honest validators, where everybody's weight copying, and then there's one guy who's actually inflating his own miners. That's no honest validators. The situation I was talking about where a product succeeds is where you have one honest validator, which means they're not artificially inflating their own weights. Yeah, I agree with you. It is bad if that happens, and the subnet would most likely fail.
Okay.
Because you don't have one honest validator.
I think there's we have a disagreement on the probability of a true honest validator, but I digress.
If the product's good enough, you're gonna have somebody who cares about having access.
Yeah,
and that's inevitable.
Yeah, I think this is where the subjectivity comes in, right? It also depends on the subnet, what the subnet's producing. Is it producing something that, say, for example, requires some centralization initially, and it's not the end of the world if there's one honest validator, or is it something that actually requires it off the get-go? That's another question that we sort of, as a collective, haven't even answered yet.
Sure. Can you think of an example where you need more than one honest validator?
Sorry, say again, your voice got cut out.
Can you think of an example where you would need more than one honest validator?
Not off the top of my head, but to use BitTensor as an example, right? We started off fairly centralized. Every project starts off fairly centralized and having one or two big validators going to honest validators. Hell, even in BitTensor itself, the Open Tensor Foundation validator is the biggest one. And if everybody started copying it, you'd still have centralization on the Open Tensor validator. So what I'm actually saying is I do agree with you in that having one honest, and by honest here, it's actually worth mentioning again, is that it's just a non-weight copying validator. It doesn't mean it's actually doing a good job. But having one validator doing its job might be enough, but down the line, you will require more. I don't think it's feasible to just put down all of the pressure on one validator for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to answer this without you stating a reason why we might need in the future. I just think of all these successful companies where they're being run under one organization and they're not failing.
Well, let's say that everyone weight copies the open tensor validator, right? For eternity. Would this project really be achieving its vision?
No, because there's not anybody who cares about having access to the product other than one person. I mean, this is just a situation where you need subnets who add value. If you don't have subnets that add value, I agree with you that BitTensor will fail. But I don't agree that that will be the future. I think that in the future there'll be subnets who create amazing products who have amazing value, and that multiple validators will want access, creating the fact where there will be multiple honest validators, weights converge to the honest validators, progress is accurately incentivized, and yeah, you create multiple businesses off that.
Right. That's the point I'm trying to get to here. Is that value and subjectivity are a big thing here. If the subnet's producing value, then it's producing value. Everyone's sort of benefiting in that sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think we're disagreeing. If it produces value, there's incentive for people not to weight copy. I'm just saying you should weight copy on subnets that aren't producing value to you because there's no reason for you not to weight copy.
I mean, one thing I'll just add is that if we look at like the subnet landscape at this point in time, I'd say there's maybe one or two that are actually producing value. And so I guess that's what worries me, is the assumption that you're making is that one validator is going to be honest because bandwidth is going to be valuable.
So this is where I think, Sami, this is where I think DTAO is essential, because I agree with you that a lot of them are pre-monetization. I think the ones that are at monetization levels are probably like FileTau, 18, 19, like very clear business model, bandwidth-based designs that make sense and probably argue for non-weight copying validators just on the base that if you're weight copying, you can't get access to the product, right? Because the miners will blacklist you because they know you're not doing anything in their consensus. But when something DTAO is, I think, very relevant for this problem where you're kind of incubating a subnet's value, because what the validators are really doing in the interim is they are bootstrapping the incentives to create more value, right? So they're like, we want to properly validate on this subnet because it's what is going to actually drive it to produce more value long term, which is I'm a large holder of the subnet, so I'm going to do that, right? Does that make sense? Whereas where it's not really the case right now with weight copying validators across the subnets, because the bottom line is dispersed across 32 or 64 subnets, rather than if they don't do the validation on the subnets that they actually have a lot of control over, they destroy the product that they are aligned with.
That actually makes sense. And I guess I have to think about it from the perspective that like a subnet needs to succeed by having other network contributors besides just like the subnet owner believe in the vision. So yeah, what you said makes sense.
Right, and that goes back to what I was saying about speculative value being just as important, especially with DTAO. This makes it a lot more clear.
Guys,
it's hard
this has
for me
been
to read through the whole chat. Did anybody notice comments?
There's a lot of good questions in here. And we trust the estimation of a subnet's value to only those who can gather stake to validate. Well, I think that you can trust people that have a lot to lose by if they break their own subnet. I think that they're much more likely to properly run a validator if that's what is in their best interest.
Someone asked, when basically what does value mean? When I'm referring to value, I'm strictly referring to monetization or future monetization.
Yeah. Mr. Niche, can you explain your subnet? Sorry, your chart here.
Exactly. So, in terms of revenue, a subnet really only needs to generate like 5, 6, 7% extra revenue for validators if from selling the product to make it more profitable to not wait copy, to run legitimately. So it's not like the value has to be enormous either for incentivizing not wait copying. And this is of course assuming that vtrust is generally high on a subnet, because the more variance in vtrust, the more wait copying is profitable. But yeah, we might not need that much.
Namari makes a good point, though. You would need to include the cost to actually validate, right? If it's like $600-700 per day to validate, honestly, you might see that this numbers don't add up. But what you're showing here is that this is the way copying provides you, say, like 2% or 3% more divs. Then the miners only need to actually produce that equivalent amount, 2%, 4%, and then it makes, and then that's also improved by things like weight copying. So not weight copying, commit reveal, right? So if with something like commit reveal, you can lower that number, we can make that percentage even less, right? Maybe it's even 98% of an honest validator with proper commit reveal strategy. Then you're forcing the validators to, if they want to maximize the returns. So if they're honestly validating, they're actually making more dividends and they get bandwidth.
But Const, don't you think it's actually good to force validators that aren't weight copying, make them have less dividends than weight copiers, so that they're forced to create a product and more have motivation? Oh, that's not a word. Motivation to create revenue from that product.
Well, I think that that's a different conversation about how we force that, and I think that comes down to delegative stake, and the take value, which is maybe something Mog wants to talk about. It's a different mechanism altogether, right?
I mean, I smile, Floppy, when I hear you say that. I mean, you could argue that, but it's not completely in the hands of the validators at the moment to be able to create value. I don't think it's a question of for most subnets. Sorry, excuse me. I don't think it's a question of validators being complacent in not being able to generate financial revenue. I just think it's a reality that the larger majority of subnets are not allowing validators to create that revenue. So by penalizing them at this stage is not helping them to invest funds. So we're still at this kind of bootstrapping phase, which is what takes me and why Jacob and I have spoken about the take and the reducing take. And I'm all for the take going to zero, but it needs to be an overlap where validators are still funded to be able to create these revenue generating machines. And I don't say this from the position of Taostats. Obviously, being a larger validator is easier, but if you look at any of the validators between, say, 50K and 200K, the margins are much smaller to be able to employ a team. To generate revenue, you need a company, you need front-end developer, what you know full well. And so if you're penalizing those, and you have a parallel operator, a weight copier, who is being better funded than you with no motivation to go, and so it's the reverse. What you're doing is you're actually creating an incentivization or motivation for people not to bother generating revenue and just to weight copy. And that's the problem with weight copiers being rewarded more than, in inverted commas, honest validation.
But Mog, let me ask you. I mean, we both know there's a couple of subnets where you can't produce revenue from. Why don't you just weight copy on those?
Well, my better response to that is, why do I have to bother validating on a subnet that I see no value in? And this is an
Exactly. That's what
issue
same question.
I found from the moment subnets came into play, that it was always sort of hoped in natural market economics that if you don't see value from it, you don't have to validate on it. But the reality is, if a subnet has 0.001%, because we are so obsessed, us validators, with where we are in the validator performance ranking, we're not going to risk, and I said this to you, we were talking privately the other day, we were looking at subnet 6, and I said it's costing me a fortune to validate, and I'm not, I'm losing on that subnet, but I'm reluctant to turn off my validator. Yeah, but this is exactly the issue. Do I weight copy on it? Do I turn off my validator? And
Well, sure, it's a useless subnet. Why would you still validate on that?
Because, well, two reasons. One, there's a
Literally nothing's
stigma.
happening on that subnet anymore.
But there's a stigma attached to weight copying, so I'm paying to not be stigmatized.
Exactly.
And then
So,
there
like,
is
you're doing
also
this
a
just for output?
competition, but there is a validator competition to be the best performant, because we're all trying to attract stake. And the way that we attract stake and delegation is by performing and having the best APR. And so any point difference on our
So you should weight
APR
copy
is
it.
incredibly important. But then now
that's
there's a
even more
stigma attached to that. There's a stigma, and that may affect your public image, and therefore that
Exactly.
will, if there are other,
Yeah, this is
you've proven the other way of doing things, which is to say, you
right.
know what, here's the best APR, I'm going to copy, and it's worked very well for you.
Well, actually, I'm actually not even weight copying on most subnets. That's why I'm a lot lower than like Owl Ventures, for example. But yeah, the main thing that I got out of what you said is the only reason you're not weight copying is because there's a stigma. What I'm trying to show is there shouldn't be a stigma, because it's not a bad thing. If there's a useless subnet and you're going to either have to run an A6000, A100 for a month, cost a couple $1,000 as well as a couple engineering hours, waste your resources doing that when you could be pointing them towards building products, funding your research lab, then that's a much more better direction for your resources, rather than, oh, I might get some hate for doing this, when in reality you're doing what's best for BitTensor.
I agree, and I do believe, although it sounds like a meme, that detail fixes this, because I won't have to concentrate my efforts into subnets where I don't believe that we can extract value through the alpha tokens. So that is
But
one of the main.
But Mog, you can use your stage now to say, weight copying on subnet 6 is not bad. I'm going to weight copy on subnet 6, because it's not, and you know it's not.
I'll sleep on it.
Mog, you should do this.
Yeah, I mean, look, the first protest we're making is subnet 0. Is saying that, look, I'm not giving weights to subnets that I don't see a value in, and I believe a greater protest would be to say I'm not going to validate on that. And I'm prepared to, we're prepared to sacrifice rewards for our delegators and ourselves, because this is what people don't realize. By delegating to subnet 0, of course, who also is losing out, the validators themselves, or all participants of the network, validators and delegators. It's an interesting paradigm.
Yeah, Mog, I don't think anybody here sees any benefit to validating on subnet 6. I don't know why we need to be so careful about what people think when they're thinking wrong. Everybody here knows on stage that there's no reason to do that. And why not at the same time get a better APR for your delegators, so that you have more stake when you need that bandwidth, especially on subnet 18 or 19?
Principle?
That's not a good reason.
Principles are important.
Is there anyone from the crowd that would like to answer that question? Silence.
I mean, another, there's just one other issue here, and this is my slight gripe with the expansion to 64, is that it's going to take us a long time now to get rid of subnets that aren't doing anything. I wonder if a mechanism could be put in place to essentially zero a subnet beyond a certain point, so we can just ignore it.
Mog, I'm giving you the solution on a platter, and nobody really has given me any reason why it's a bad solution. Wait copy.
Crickets. It's the thing of here's the interesting thing about wait copying is that there's two camps, right? There's the camp that really feels like by running the validator on some subnets that they're propping up BitTensor, right? And you mentioned it yourself, Fish. You were like, hey, you know, in a DTAO environment, there'll be some subnets where, like, if nobody validates, then the subnet will fall apart, right? You said that, and
Right. And I think that's
so-
a good thing.
And but isn't that true? Like, I think maybe we're at the precipice of that changing for BitTensor, but initially, it was the case that was the truth for most subnets, if not all of them, probably all of them on BitTensor. So if you wait copied and everyone wait copied, then BitTensor itself will fall apart, right? Do you see?
No, I think what that does is it now gives 7,200 tau per day motivation motivation to create one product that has some sort of value, any non-zero value, and you get a massive return to do that.
Because
So
the other
one
I
of-
guess
one of
maybe,
these-
maybe I'd take a
what-
shot.
Yeah, Nick, please.
Like, okay, so if you have a situation where right now the subnet is not producing any value, but in the future it's going to produce some fixed amount of value, everybody is incentivized to wait copy, and then you're assuming that there's one person who will be honest and push the subnet forward because they know that there's going to be this value in the future. They also have to assume that everybody who's wait copying will eventually then start validating and compete with them for that fixed pie of values. So then it's like reducing the amount of marginal value that they can take. So it's not actually like a fixed one for one where like they're always going to be incentivized to at least have one honest validator pushing it forward.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying. And the value would still have to outweigh their percentage of stake in relation to total stake. This is something else that also gets fixed with DTAO, when you can basically accumulate 100% of the alpha tokens, no problem, if nobody else sees any value in it, and then now you have 100% of the bandwidth.
Not quite 100% because you always
agreed.
You have GDT, right? Mama Network.
Right, but those people aren't validating, so you still are the only one with bandwidth.
They are validating.
Well, we can assume they're copying weights if they don't have value in it, see value in it. Well, they should be. I mean, in 2 years when we have all these subnets, everyone's going to be copying weights, and it's going to be a good thing. I guess I'm just ahead of my time.
Would this mean that? Does it make sense to actually just implement a weight copying mechanism directly into the chain? Just press
Yes.
this button and weight copy.
I think so.
And this is what I said at the beginning of the call. It would effectively be like a validator delegating their stake to another validator on the network.
Right. Yeah, I think it's good for a multitude of reasons. And then the built-in weight copy script could just copy the honest validators, and bada bing, bada boom. Honest validators have more bandwidth, miners have less costs, you converge quicker.
So in the future, who's weight copying on a detail subnet? Someone with detail tokens who sees value or token state to them, who sees value in their subnet in the future, but doesn't see any value in the subnet in the future, so they weight copy.
I actually think weight copying goes away a lot in DTAO because you wouldn't own the token if you didn't care about the product.
Exactly.
So you wouldn't validate on it.
Yeah, so a subnet would need sufficiently many validators to see value, i.e. more than one or just one, and then you don't need any weight copying directly you don't need a weight copying ability on chain, right? Because weight copying won't exist if
Right.
using your theory of you need to have value in order to validate.
I agree.
Hey, on Gad.
Hello, how's
Malicious
it going?
validator.
Hey, very well, man. Welcome to the stage.
Thanks,
You
Jacob.
had a, you had a good
Um,
question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Fish, like what exactly you are referring to when you talk about a revenue generating subnet. So for example, on our subnet, it's subnet 11, we encourage miners to open source role play models. And I was just wondering, like, say we're able to get, it's still very early days for us. Miners are submitting 8 billion parameter models, but say we're able to get, our goal is to get to a state of the art role play experience. And we do have an app that's live on the App Store. And we like, the problem we're solving is there's no good open source alternative to like models by closed source companies like Character AI. So Character AI is the second most used consumer AI app. They have proprietary model. And so we're trying to create a good open source role play alternative. And so say we used the best miner submitted model, right? And we hosted that model on our own GPUs. And we use that model to power our app, which is our goal. And that app and said app generated revenue. Is that what you mean by revenue, or are you referring to revenue in some other way generated by a subnet?
No, if you're open sourcing your model and then the app is just using the open source model to produce revenue, that's not actually value created by the subnet, because anybody can now go create their company without even having any knowledge of BitTensor connecting to that open source model and making the same amount of revenue. Why do you think Character AI doesn't open source their model? Because it was a bad business decision, because now they lose their competitive advantage.
So like I'm kind of confused. What do you see as the long-term like vision goal of BitTensor? And like I'm curious, Jacob, like if you have Jacob, Ala, or other people on stage, like do you guys have a different long-term view? Like yeah, just
I,
just
I,
just Fish would love to get a sense of like what do you think is the goal of BitTensor even?
Yeah, I'll go first and then I'll let Constantship answer. But I think it's very clear. I think BitTensor has a very clear path to monetization. I believe in the future of BitTensor massively. I'm putting my entire life into BitTensor. I'm hiring people. I'm spending lots and lots of money investing in this project because I know that in the future we'll have amazing top tier world class products hosted on the BitTensor network, generating revenue, multi-billion-dollar businesses built on each BitTensor subnet, each on a different validator, and then each one is monetizing that, all funneling value back to the commodity produced by each BitTensor subnet. And I don't think that's actually that far away. Conch, you can go ahead.
So I get this. Okay, sorry to sort of poke into that. I'm just like more higher resolution. Like if you could like give me an example of like a business, like one like what something a subnet created, a business built on top of it, and how that would be worth billions of dollars, and then that commodity is closed source as well. Like I'm not understanding
Yeah,
like how this would actually work.
yeah. I mean, to me, it's pretty clear because the communication layer between the miner and validator, that's not open to the public. A validator asks a question, the miner responds it only goes to the validator IP. That's closed source. Nothing about that is open. Only the validator has access. They can now sell access to that. They can sell API access to proxy to their validator, or they can just sell it as a product.
And so more specifically, like what product do you see like being produced? Who's the end customer? Where is the money coming in?
Yeah, I think it's most obvious right now with subnet 18 and 19 and what Mog is doing with Corcel. We can already sell enterprise production API keys to subnet 18 and 19 because they're producing value. They're providing access to something that people pay for every day.
I think other examples of this, like there's sort of some structures. Like we started this call talking about incentive landscapes that work and ones that don't work. And there's structures that you can create in the incentive landscape that makes sense. It's the same thing with all the subnets. Like there's some landscapes or there's some incentivization mechanisms that work well and produce something that then goes to the TAO holders, the validators in the network, that you could monetize. Like perfect example, I think really cookie cutter example is say file TAO, Jason's file TAO subnet. That like there's effectively 2 point something exabytes of storage there. The validators get access to that bandwidth, and that the miners will only store files in proportion to the amount of tau you have. So if you have a company that's doing large scale storage, the relationship between tau's value in that subnet and this digital commodity is really obvious. Now, it might not be the same for other subnets that maybe haven't quite figured out that product market fit. You know, Mutex here on the call, like his subnet is like just starting. He's trying to figure out how the monetization would happen. But probably the long term, the idea would be, hey, a validator has the ability to get the miners to do neural architecture search, excuse me, search for some client. Like they have that control. And I don't know if that's a $100 billion company or a $10 billion company. I don't know much about it. Nas here on the stage can probably tell you more. But no matter how you structure a subnet on BitTensor, that there is a relationship between tau held in the subnet and your ability to determine what the miners do. So you have to figure out how you're going to get the miners to do something that you want them to do. And yeah, search. You got to search the space of potential incentive mechanisms to find that. Does that make sense, Angrad? Hopefully, I'm saying
it does. Yeah, that's really useful. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
People like, but some people like don't get this, and like I've seen some subnets where it's more like a company comes and like, oh, I'm going to try to create a subnet, and that subnet's going to be for my like app, right? But this is a bad design, because you actually want to build a subnet that would be generally valuable to anybody that has tau. Like there has to be multiple clients, and it can't just be you, only you. Someone said in the general chat, like, oh, why would I ever come to BitTensor and pay, $600,000 to create a subnet to do some sort of work? It's like, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. The subnet owners are not the ones creating some product for themselves. Like that will never work in BitTensor. It's not the way that it's not the process that we're trying to create. Ala, do you have any extensions on that?
No, I think everybody really nailed really nailed it. The one thing I was chatting with a few folks. I think Yoav's also in the audience, and he mentioned a very interesting point. And it's something that I think we need to also be conscious of here. Is all solutions that we present are always going to be approximate, asymptotic, right? Just like how we say, we're gonna try and eliminate weight copying. Weight copying is still going to be possible, but it's less beneficial, right? So you're not going to end up with like a black and white solution. There's never going to be a black and white solution on BitTensor. It's always going to be approximate. It's always going to be a way to demotivate bad actors. But if people want to act badly and still weight copy, they might still try to do it. And that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind here when we're presenting all these solutions, whether it's DTAU or whether it's weight copying or whatever else. Does that sort of make sense? It's a tad off topic, but it's just something I've been seeing circulating in the chat as well.
Who's John?
John Burden.
Bring John on.
John's an epic miner and has open sourced a lot of cool models.
Oh, cool. Let's bring John on. John is the man. Where's John?
His comment says the speakers are actively promoting weight copying and chasing. This is the minor equivalent. No. I think it's important to mention that what I was referring to is actually well, I guess I spent the whole call saying how I thought weight copying was good, not just for the rewards. For example, with Subnet 6. I don't
John's
think
gonna get
anybody
his mic.
responded to me there.
I think here's a differing opinion. I really want to hear John Durbin. Hoorah, John, come on.
So did you send him an invite?
Yeah, he's coming up. Dr. P's on stage as well. Hey, Dr. P.
GM. Good to be here.
Hey, John. Lovely to have you, man.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear,
Hey,
man.
John.
Hey guys. Yeah, sorry, I'm being a little sassy in the chat.
We
Let me get the
appreciate
game.
it.
We love the sass.
We're very familiar with SAS.
Yeah, so I guess what I don't understand is weight copying is fine apparently according to the chat that we've had. And I missed kind of half of it. Sorry, I'm out of breath. I had to run to a mic. I've been watching the kids, twin toddlers, keep me busy. But yeah, so basically what we're saying is that we should weight copy, but I just don't understand why you have to validate on a subnet at all. Like if you don't see any value and you set the root weight to 0, why should you be allowed to weight set at all? Especially with, like the bug fish that you have on subnet 2, supposedly a bug, where you're just randomly nuking miners and costing them, whatever the reg fee is at the time. It's like 3.2 tau.
Right.
So you're doing all of this, but you're getting emissions. You're causing kind of havoc to the miners. Like you're just randomly deregging miners.
Right.
And then you have root weight set to 0, so you're actually burning all of the emission for the miners that you would be setting from the weights anyway. So like I don't understand. Like you're just punishing miners because you want a flatter incentive curve? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. And that actually might be a really cool feature to add into BitTensor. Instead of me having to weight copy on a subnet that I don't care about, I can just resign from the subnet, get the same emissions as the average, revoke my bandwidth, and then yeah, I would do that if that was an option, and then set the average if there was a built-in weight copying feature. I don't care about setting weights on that subnet.
Right.
So one thing about this subnet too, I want to point out, like we didn't talk about this earlier in the call, but a flat incentive curve like this is actually really dangerous for BitTensor because, as you just brought up, John, a relatively small validator, well, he's not a medium-sized validator, something 1,000 tau is a lot, but not as big as, say, the OpenTensor Foundation, can just through human error or maliciousness nuke miners. And that's because this incentive landscape is flat.
Mhm.
If the incentive landscape was not flat, you can't do that, right? Because your perturbation is going to be small relative to the other validators. And then also, like on a curve like this, it's very easy to do the opposite, right? So randomly nuking miners, but the opposite would be you incentivize your own, right? Because you can just keep your miners up at the top of the list and no one can see that it's non-transparent. So this is a bad curve for that reason as well, because basically you can do a Yuma consensus attack on this, right? You are out of consensus.
It's happening right now in subnet 14, actually.
And does subnet 14 have a flat curve as well?
If you look at the weights for subnet 14, there's a validator with 200,000 stake only weighting like 40% of the miners, which are his cold keys.
Yeah, exactly. So on subnet 14, the same thing, right? And that's because of this flat. It has a flat curve, which is really dangerous for the subnet, right? I think that, yeah, the straight line of death. But John, I'm really happy you're up on the stage. Let's continue the conversation. You had a bunch of comments in here throughout the day. Do you want to continue speaking about them?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I guess to that point, though, a flat incentive curve is more up to the subnet owners and the developers. It's not like I don't see the point of punishing the miners in this way. But anyways, I guess that's beside the point.
Are you punishing
the
the
comment
miners?
that I just what's that?
Fish, are you punishing the miners purposely here?
Yeah, no, it's not intentional. But the point remains that I could do it if I wanted to, which is bad because of the subnet design.
But at the same time, like the miners can also, there are plenty of subnets where you have basically one miner, whether it's one cold key or not, it's one miner that owns over 50%. So the miners have the ability to completely nuke validators as well, too, honest ones anyway. I mean, they can't do anything about weight copying, but they can just block all requests from any validator they don't like, and then
but that's fine. Yeah, they should be able to choose who they give bandwidth to. That's one of the features of decentralization.
Right, but in this case, you're saying that any single validator should be able to just completely nuke a miner from existence.
They should be able to have their stake weight effect. I mean, that's the whole value proposition of Tau, is so they can do that.
Sure. Okay. And then I guess my other point is that you're saying that you should wait copy because there's no value, so it's too much work and all this stuff. And I understand that from a monetary perspective, but it's also like, shouldn't we be all trying to build this product better? And if you're saying like it's good for the miners because it would be less load, that again is something that's very easy to fix in the code. You just change, like on subnet 17, they ended up putting a cap on the number of requests, or on subnet 27, they're now distributing the challenges by the block number to different validators. Like, there are ways around all these different problems, but to not have actual validators running, I mean, I get your point that until there's actually a product, it's not super useful, but part of the like half of the subnets are in the research phase anyway. Like, this whole system is basically in the research phase. So you're saying like, don't even bother building the product because there's no product, but like you kind of need to work as a team. And I think it was Mog, someone was mentioning that if you're the only honest validator, you're the only one that ever has to, or like gets to, or should, or does work with the developers and the miners and fixes problems and all this stuff. You're putting a massive onus on the rest of the team, which again, if you're only in it for the incentives and you don't care about actually pushing BitTensor forward as a whole, that's fine. But I would hope that more people would actually step up to the plate and try to push this thing forward instead of just being in it for the Tau,
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before, but weight copying just converges the honest validator. So I don't think if they stopped weight copying it, it helps anybody, or if they weight copy it, it doesn't hurt anybody.
Well, exclusively on the incentive mechanism, but it doesn't help the network as a whole. So, like Wombo, for example, they tried to actually. What's that?
But it doesn't hurt the network.
Well, but it does, because like Wombo, for example, they tried to integrate subnet 30 into their product, but because half the time none of the validators actually had an axon served, like it couldn't actually serve any of the images. And the validators that did actually serve images, or had an open endpoint, they were getting overwhelmed because it was way too much actual user traffic going to that single validator. So it's like you say it doesn't hurt the network, and you want product and you want money, but then by doing the weight copying and by not actually serving any of the requests, the network fails completely.
There's a couple of reasons why what you said shouldn't be the case. Number one, you said the miners would just blacklist the one validator that actually has access to the network. If this is the case where everybody else is weight copying, miners should be able to see this. They should blacklist those weight copiers, and then the bandwidth there should be a re-equilibrium of bandwidth re-weighted based on the non-weight copying validators. So it shouldn't matter who's weight copying or not. You still have the same amount of total bandwidth, but that bandwidth is now centralized between the validators with an axon.
Right, but I'm saying that it won't work because the validators that do have an axon don't have enough capacity. Enough hardware.
John, can you explain a little bit what you're speaking about with subnet 30? Like, what exactly happened here? Like case study.
And I think isn't someone actually?
There's two people here in the audience. We could bring Ben or Vivek, either.
Vivek? Yeah, okay. Vivek.
Validators just didn't have the hard truth.
So what was happening up there? One of the co-founders here at Wombo and the head of engineering. We were trying to use subnet 30 to run a style from our app, exclusively powered by BitTensor. But the problem was whenever we sent too many requests to the subnet, the validators would kind of just not be able to handle the load that's coming in. And then we have like 20 or so miners that are actually working, and the rest of them are just wait copying. And so the onus falls on those 20. And so they can't actually provide the throughput that we need. And so we had to kind of decrease the amount of load we were sending our subnet from our app because the validators were just like not validating traffic.
I think the problem here though comes from the assumption that validators should be doing a service to give Wombo all the access that they need. Like
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Like that should just come from Wombo's validator. They shouldn't even be able to connect to other validators unless they're paying validators to do that. And if they are paying validators to do that, then validators should be able to afford to increase their server capacity so that they can handle the load. Otherwise, your costs are greater than your expenses, and you shouldn't even be running that API through BitTensor anyways.
So from my understanding, my rudimentary understanding here, please correct me if I'm wrong, is the validators, when they validate our subnet, get like part of that 41% of emission that we get on our subnet, correct? And so
Right.
in theory, they are getting paid, and they're getting paid pretty handsomely to handle
But they have
this
no
load for
reason.
us.
They have no reason to upscale their servers to handle your requests when you're not compensating them to do that.
But the network is compensating them.
The network's compensating
not
them
do
for
that.
reaching a consensus of the scores, though, not for providing.
It's true that the network is incentivizing them to do that, Vivek, but the network is not incentivizing them to do that thing that you want them to do, right? So Wombo should really be paying them for their bandwidth, right? Like,
I see.
right? So you guys, hey, validators wrote this request. Use your bandwidth that they're holding on the tab for you, right? Do that request for me, but it should be actually inverted. That you should be paying them. You should be like, hey, give us your bandwidth, right? That's what monetizes the TAO in the first place. There's a longer conversation to be had here about like how we want to tail off validation rewards eventually, and so there's mostly just minor rewards, and the validators are getting paid nothing to run on the network because they're, as a result of validating, they're getting the outputs, right? They're getting the actual commodity.
Right, and the amount that you pay them should be greater than their increased server expenses to handle that capacity. Otherwise, it's a business strategy that's losing money.
I guess I fundamentally misunderstood the point of the network then, because my understanding, I guess, was that the validators were sort of designed to serve as the public entry point to the network, like for the subnets.
Dang.
They are.
I think if
want
there was
one,
more
so-
long form, sorry to cut anyone off, but I think if there was more long form writing, Fish, like we get to hear your like viewpoint in like short bursts here and there, or like if there was just more long form writing on like, I guess like there does seem to be like John's one of the really great super active miners. Some of us are very new subnet owners. Like our subnet is just like about 2 weeks old, and so if there was more long form writing, like I have spent a good amount of time like on reading the white paper and vision and stuff like that, but I think like some more long form documentation would be really useful for the new subnet owners. But please go ahead, John and Jacob and everyone else.
I totally agree with that sentiment.
And not only
So
that,
if they're
the responsibility of the validators is to incubate and educate subnet owners on this, which is why it should be validators should be incentivized to spend time and resources and funds to help subnet owners understand the direction that subnet creation and monetization and revenue should be going.
Yes.
Got it. So I guess the question that I have then is, as our subnet gets more emissions, God willing or whatever, right? Like hopefully we get more missions. If we get more missions, why do validators end up getting more of a chunk than if they're only doing a base level of service?
So your subnet doing well, right? Means right now with the root network design, like what are we setting weights on, right? We're setting weights on things that are producing value, where the miners are producing value for the Tau that is owned by the validators. That's the thing we're thinking about, right? So, or at least we try our best, right? So, subnet 21, right? Okay, wow, look, okay, all of this emission is going through the subnet. It's producing all of this exabytes of available storage. It's all available to the Tau holders. On Wombo, like I understand you guys are generating a lot of images, right? So that's why subnet owners should be thinking, okay, how do I maximize this digital commodity that my miners are producing so that that thing is going to go to the validators on the subnet? And if you maximize that return, then there's more and more and more and more incentive for the validators to actually validate, because if they actually validate, the miners will actually return that digital commodity to them. So that's the best way to get validators to actually validate on the subnet. Subnet 18 is a perfect example, right? If you don't validate on subnet 18 properly, if you purely wait copy, the miners have no incentive to return your requests, and that's the negative for them. It's also the positive for them to actually validate. So, for your subnet SM30, we need to ask the questions like, okay, how can we get the miners to produce the most amount of value for the validators? And rather than, I think, like the conception of the subnet owners are building something for themselves, it's more like the subnet owners are building something for Tau holders.
For validators.
For validators, they're building. It's kind of Caro explained this to me a little bit about a good mental framework for a subnet is that a subnet owner is a little bit like the franchise creator, right? So McDonald's, perfect example, right? So they build a franchise, and then the validators are the ones that are the individual franchise locations. Like you own like a validator like owns the McDonald's, but they've taken the design that created by the subnet owner. The subnet owner has produced a marketable structure that is attractive to people to want to hold Tau in the subnet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm just going to jump in here briefly. I don't want to claim that our subnet's code accomplishes this idea perfectly, but I do want to claim that that's very much our intention. And when we sort of set a roadmap and design for what our subnet does, it's do high volume, high quality, low cost inference on a variety of content producing AI models with the sort of longer term goal of incentivized virality. But because we sort of hit a block on just that first piece, the high volume, cheap, high quality, reliable inference of AI models, like it's hard to get to the actual goal of the subnet.
This is a great conversation, I think, for us to have about like how we can do that and where that block is. But in the interest of this call's over 2.5 hours, guys, I think that there's people putting their kids to bed and stuff in the chat. Let's leave that for another day. And just a thanks to everyone to come. Unless there's any like last minute questions here for everyone on stage, this is a scintillating conversation, really motivation all around for us to come back next week and do this again. Mog, lovely to have you on stage. Namare, thank you, Fish, for your opinions. Shib, great to have you up here again, man. And yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. Let's end it here.
Thanks all. This was great as always.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.